So let's get on to answering some of the questions. So Satu asks, we encounter some processing problems on time to time with sheeting the dough, disruption of sheets while rolling out the dough. Although we change the water rate by checking the dough texture, it is not indicative of a proper processing without problems. What is the main reason which makes for dough unmachinable? What are the points that we should be careful about buying flour? How can we solve this problem? We also use vital gluten to support flour and analyze the flour using fluorinograph. Thank you. So I would take the roundtable approach on this. I'll let Arnaud answer it first, and then we'll go on to Mark. Arnaud, what do you think?
Well, it's always tricky to have this kind of question because as we are just not near. But what we can see here, I can see there's a disruption of the sheet while rolling out, and immediately I think about dough extensibility. And there are two things that come to my end: dough extensibility and dough elasticity. And these two parameters are typically parameters that you can perfectly measure with an alveograph, but not with a fluorinograph, for instance. Not saying that fluorinograph is a bad machine, but it's not done for that. So here we are speaking about extensibility of the dough, elasticity of the dough. So you need a tool that is able to test this.
So will the alveograph work for that?
I think the alveograph should provide interesting information on this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Mark, what are your thoughts on this? What should
the alveograph would definitely help provide much better information to deal with the situation. It's also very much dependent on environmental situations in terms of temperature and things like that.
Which is a real question too. So can you answer this part? What is the main reason which makes their dough unmachinable?
It can be many things, because if the depending on the fat system that's being used, if the environment is very cool and the fat becomes too rigid, that can contribute to it. If the fat becomes too soft and that it allows the dough to tear too much, that could be a problem as well. So there's a lot of factors when it comes to a puff pastry. It's much more complex than a relatively simple bread dough in that sense, right? Because this whole lamination process is what is creating your whole leavening system as well, right? I mean, down the line, right? But yes, initially, in terms of the dough being disrupted, as he mentioned, we're presuming it's tearing or something like that, and it is one extensibility, and that extensibility is affected by the fat system in the whole system as well, right?
Right.
And it can be other things. I mean, they're adding vital wheat gluten, so that changes from crop to crop as well, right? So that's not definitely a constant, right? And again, fluorinograph is going to end up giving them misleading information that is really good for bread dough production, but not necessarily as applicable to a puff pastry.
Yeah. I would also like to add to that with lamination and puff pastry, temperature is crucial. Right.
Absolutely,
so
very crucial.
If you are working in a bakery that can't control your temperature, things are going to go really south when the temperature goes up, especially in the summer month. So you're going to have tearing problems in the summer month, where it's fine in the winter months. But temperature of the dough and the fat needs to be as close as possible. You can't put a hot dough in a cold fat. It's just going to ruin everything. It's just going to tear everything. Okay. So you need to look at temperature. You also need to look at dough conditioners. If you are going at a really high rate, which I think you are, you need to have the dough conditioners that relaxes the dough, that makes it more machinable. Okay. We have a page that talk about reducing agents. So go take a look at that. So I really do think that engineers don't understand that output rates are one of the biggest issues and causes of product quality. You know, when you turn up the cuts, when you turn up the packaging line, when you turn everything up, you know, quality suffers. So what do? We have to add in dough conditioners to give that margin of error. You know, so if you're going to increase output rates, don't think that your product can handle it, because it can't. You need to increase the dough conditioners. So a lot of issues that we see with engineering is the inability to keep up with the output, and that causes a lot of quality issues. So I say, look at your output rates. Can you come down on that a little bit, right? And if you come down on that a little bit and you see a huge improvement in product, then it's got something to do with your dough conditioners. Okay, so you have to work between dough conditioner, flour quality, and output rates. So these are the three things I would recommend you to look at. So that's all I wanted to add on that one. All right, so let's go to our next question. How many different flour protocols are published? I believe this is for Arnaud.
Well, that really depends on which device we are speaking about. On the MixoLab, we have a full book of applications which are dealing with many different kind of flours, and not only wheat. I mean, it can be barley, it can be rye, it can be a lot of things, including also gluten-free products. So here we have a lot of publication. On the alveograph, it's still more limited because the alveograph is using a simple type of dough, which is flour and water and salt. What we have been doing until now is adapting the protocol to have different answers, like longer mixings or these kind of things. But again, most of the time, these are things we are doing confidentially, because of course, when we are working with bakers, we cannot communicate about what we obtain. That give us idea of what can work and not work, and so we gain time for the next one, but we are not sharing information from one baker to another one. That should not be fair, and most of the time it should not work anyway. So yeah, the short answer is, for MixoLab we have a lot of protocol. For the alveograph is still not that extensive.
Okay. Oh, I think I missed some questions. Sorry about that. What should we care about, external or internal quality? Will a MixoLab someday be used more readily than a farinograph?
Okay, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but somewhere I understand the question.
I think the question is, correct me if I'm not, Renee, is whether MixoLab will be the standard like farinograph is today.
Okay, so first of all, I have to say that the MixoLab is a standard, is an international standard. So it can be used for every kind of transaction, and even more. The MixoLab includes the way of assessing grain, so you can use it during grain trading, which is not the case of the farinograph, where you don't have information about how to use that on grain. So there are two kinds of MixoLab. There is the MixoLab, which is the beauty of it, which all information. And in fact, if you are taking the farinograph, you're just taking 20% of this information only, which is the beginning of the test. And now this 20% of the information, there is a new standard which has been published, but it's in France, which is giving the equivalent or same kind of information that you can have with the farinograph. So my answer will be that yes, we can replace that, but at the same time, if we only limit the MixoLab to what is doing the farinograph, we are losing 80% of the benefit of the MixoLab. Because the MixoLab is bringing you a lot of information on what's happening when you are heating up the dough and cooling down the dough, and particularly all about starch properties. And typically when I say, if you have a problem with shelf life, the shelf life issue relies with starch properties. And these starch properties on the mixer lab, we can assess them very well because we are on a dough system, not on the batter. So the information we got from the mixer lab is very relevant to this kind of issue. So that's why just reducing the mixer lab to the farinograph is really a loss of information. But if we want, we can do that.
Yeah. Mark, any thoughts, or should we move on?
I think we can move on from that.
Okay.
And
so Mark, why don't you take a stab at this next question? We have issues with our dough from batch to batch, even when we did add the same amount of water. Some dough is sticky while other is okay. Dough texture also change depending if we are using flour from our box system or sack flour. What can we do to improve the quality of our dough?
Well, that is, it goes, we had a conversation, you and I, about this.
It's a very, very common problem.
Yeah. Talk to your miller. So usually if you're going from bulk to sack flour, that usually means that you have the sack flour as a backup when you can't get the bulk delivery in time or something like that on your, and I don't know all the circumstances of your situation, but it's important to be in communication with your supplier, that is, so if you're getting the sack flour from a distributor and not direct from the miller, make sure you get the C of A with that as well, so you have all the relative information, because that'll help tell you things that you may need to adjust for in terms of absorption and mixing time and so on, because it could be either. It could be a water absorption issue, it could be a dough stability issue, right? So that's important, and because they're not necessarily always milled from the same grist. And that's, as Arnaud talked about in terms of regionality and things like that, even within a flour miller's source region, that depending on where you are, that can change a lot. I mean, if you're in Kansas area, well, then it's going to be fairly consistent for most of the season. But if you're in Jamaica, you got to deal with whatever's on this boat and then what's on the next boat, and it can be night and day, right? So it's talking with your miller is going to help you the most to know what you actually have in that sack versus what you have in the silo. That's going to be or you invest in an alveolograph and all the other instruments to check all your flour yourself. But that it would be a considerable investment unless it's worth your while in terms of your volume, right?
Right. So I would totally agree with Mark. In addition, I want to point out that you probably use some form of dough conditioners, and dough conditioner use need to be flour specific. Like you cannot use one kind of dough conditioners for different kinds of flour. If you're working at that bulk stage, you have to use one dough conditioning system for one kind of flour. And the differences between, to me, it feels like the differences between aged and green flour. Your sack flour is probably aged, and your bulk flour is probably green, milled and used less than 2 weeks. So there's a huge difference there.
Yeah. I mean, it can be just simply even moisture in the flour. I mean,
correct.
We would see that all the time. Like in the lab that I was working in Illinois, I mean, we'd check the moisture on the flour. Sometimes we'd only have 11% moisture left on the flour because it's been sitting in the lab for so long, it simply starts to evaporate. Right?
Yeah, and the best thing is to really streamline your flour consumption. Just move directly all to bulk. Don't use both.
Yep.
Right.
And work with your miller to make sure that you have consistent, reliable supply.
I think your miller
and with all procurement people, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Have an alternate and a third alternate supplier certified, so that if accidents happen, problems happen, and a mill may have an issue and they pick up the phone and say, we're not going to have this load to you for tomorrow, right? Well, then you need to be able to pick up the phone and call your alternate suppliers and say, I need a load of XYZ tomorrow. Can you supply it? And That's what it's all about. I mean, a lot of times the millers work within their network and support each other and say, like, I can't get this to my ABC customer tomorrow. Can you supply them a load? I'll clear it with them, right? But it does require that they're already cleared in terms of being an approved supplier for all the meeting the specifications and things, because different mills run differently. They have, some mills have higher starch damage, and there's it all depends on the types of roll stands, how many roll stands, all kinds of things. So it is as I so often say, it's such a ubiquitous common ingredient that is misunderstood and taken for granted, because it is the largest ingredient in bread, but it is very complex.
Right.
I've heard a lot of scientists say that one of the reasons wheat is not genetically modified is that it's just too complicated to do it, right? I mean, it's just such a complex ingredient.
Right. Next question, Arnaud. This one's for you. What are your thoughts on blending wheat according to the falling number? We have had random batches of flour that are custom milled for us have too high falling numbers, 500 plus on white hard spring wheat. This led to fermentation issues in our dough. So Mark, you can chime in as well.
Okay,
Go ahead, Arnaud. Yeah.
So blending based on just falling numbers.
Well, that's okay. First of all, I'm hearing about 500 falling number. When you have values at this level, it means that you have no amylase activity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's something I've seen often. People saying, okay, I have 500. It's because last time it was 600. Okay, calm down. That's exactly the same thing. You have no activity. So I think also this is part of the thing we should really look at. I think when you are starting reaching levels of let's say between 60 and 350 or up to 400, okay, that's the area where you have information. But above 400, it's all the same. Then what you are measuring are starch properties, no amylase activity. So first of all, I would say if you have higher than 400, okay, you have no amylase activity, you're not going to work on this. And then after, for blending, we know that for blending falling number, you need to work through the liquefaction number. You cannot mix them directly, the numbers of falling number. There is a little mathematical thing to do, and you can do so. But I mean, it will not really give you it will give you part of the information about proofing, but it can give you an information about what will be the gas production. Of course, if you have a lower falling number, you will have a higher gas production, but this is not an issue if you have the gluten network that holds it. And we can see that, in some areas, we are speaking about 300 trace limits for the falling number. In France, it's 250. In other countries, 280. So since you are in this area, I don't think it makes a lot of difference. So that's an indicator if you want to mix, but I would not base my mixing only on this parameter.
Okay.
Yeah, it's always with these things is that we can't look at one analysis, one item in isolation. It's a family situation, right? I mean, it's all of these things together, as Arnaud puts. It's very key to look at all of them, right? And
I feel like we need to have another seminar on this, Mark, where we touch on all these topics. What to look for and what to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's get on to the next question. I skipped a few in the beginning. Is the whole wheat flour alveolab method available or not?
Not yet, but very soon it should be next year.
Okay.
It's we had a wonderful team working on that, and now we are just finalizing the software part of it, because it needs to have a software adaptation. So yeah, that should be released during next year.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to skip pass this particular question because I don't really know what it means. Arnaud, how many different flour protocols are published? If you don't know, then what this question is, let's skip it. Do you?
No.
Okay. What would you recommend if the flour results in a sticky dough for white pan bread and dough conditioners are not allowed? That's very little you can do. Mark, what do you think?
Fermentation, water absorption adjustments, mixing adjustments. If you're a sticky dough, you might be over mixing. You might be under fermenting. There's a lot of different things it could be. This sounds like it's something like an artisan type bread where they want to be true to traditional methods. And
no, it's not artisan bread. That's white pan bread.
Oh, white pan bread, but no dough conditioners allowed.
Yeah,
that's unusual. Right?
Yeah, that's tough. So yeah, that requires some discussion on our forum. So let's bring that.
That would be a great place
to
bring that.
Right. Just one addition, if I may, just on this one.
Yeah, sure.
I would have a look to starch damage.
Yes. Yeah.
Make sure it's not too high.
Okay. Good suggestion. Next question. I'm running a flour mill with focus on R&D and corporate sales, also making the flour and selling as per customers' demand. Oh, I guess that must be a comment. That's not a question.
Yeah, then he expands some more yet further.
Yeah. Which quality control equipment will benefit the manufacturing sites to prepare for adjustments in mixing area? We tend to have a lot of pH issues. Cracker manufacturer. Mark, do you have any to add to that? I would think extensibility is a huge issue with the pH.
Yeah. And pH that's usually more of a problem on soft wheat flour. And
yeah, it's crackers.
Yeah. And so are they making sure that they're not getting stuff that's blended in that's chlorinated? Right, because that's the main source of pH changes most of the time. What in the U.S. is often referred to as a bleached soft wheat flour. It's chlorine gas is used, and it drops the pH down to like 4.2. And so that is usually because most of the time the pH ranges in standard soft wheat flours wouldn't be much of an issue. Right?
Yeah, if you're using non-chlorinated flour, I wouldn't see why pH would be an issue unless there is you can't control your fermentation with the crackers.
Because the lowering of the pH through the chlorination denatures the protein, so they would have mixing issues. Then they wouldn't get much gluten development because you can't develop gluten really at that point anymore.
Okay.
That would be great to bring to the forum as well, to flesh out more of the details.
To bring to our forum as well. Yeah. I've worked with various buyers from bread manufacturers to biscuit. Wait, I lost that question.
Says they send almost identical specs and then they complain about the results on the flours give on the line. Well, that speaks to what Arnaud was talking about in the protocols and understanding everything as to how the flour is being used. So it's not just the alveograph specs alone, but also other things like baking quality and so on. I mean, I know with bread flours, with my time with ADM, is that there are central labs in the UK, Canada, and the US that bake all of the mill streams daily on a continuous basis, so that they're constantly seeing what is happening and can relay that information to the bread bakers, so that it changes all the time, even throughout the season. Of course, the big changes, as Lin mentioned, are the seasonal adjustments from crop year to crop year, right? But there's ongoing changes that happen regionally and things like that. So you need to look at adjusting your tests or adding to your tests as to how the product is being used, so that what you're doing with bread is going to be different from what you need for a biscuit or a cookie and for pasta. These are so desperately different products that have no relation to each other, so that you'd have to have very different testing protocols for these.
Okay, thanks. The next question, it's not very well typed out, and whenever somebody types a new question, I get kicked out. So Tony's question is, because I have experienced this, we make one batch of 500 grams pizza flour with excellent results. Very big bender equipment is excellent to analyze flour. The miller can't see the result, but the final pizza consumers say it's excellent. My question is how to tell millers to understand the end quality of the pizza customer.
I'm not sure I really understand the question here.
Yeah, Tony, if you could rewrite that question. I don't really quite understand it, Tony. So if you could rewrite it, that'll be great.
Sorry.
We don't know what your exact question is. Let's continue on with Lindsay's question. We are having issues with a dough that contains preservatives. Our dough is used to make tortillas and flatbread. When the dough is pressed to a certain size, then it shrinks. Does the pH affect the elasticity of the dough? What can we do to have a good quality dough with preservatives? Lindsay, what are your preservatives? I want to know. Mark, do you have any insights on this?
It sounds like they're using a preservative that may not be ideal for this type of product. Calcium propionate would be best, and that's usually not going to have as much effect on pH or dough elasticity. It's not going to cause it to shrink. But if they're using something,
sorbic acid,
yeah, if they're using, or if they're using like Regent 12X or something like that, one of the very low pH acids, and trying to drop the pH of their dough, that is going to have an effect on elasticity. That's going to tighten up the gluten a lot.
I agree with that. And best thing to do is to use encapsulated sorbic acid.
That's the other thing, to use encapsulated
products.
Yeah, from Belchem. Yeah, they have a lot of experience with that.
Yeah.
If I can just add something, just based on the flour quality, in that case, my indication would be to look at the elasticity index on the alveo. Because if you start with a flour which has a too high extensibility, and we have seen many times the case with pizza and even French bread, then the patty shrinks, and that's an indicator that most of the people disregard. We prefer to focus on what we know, the W, the P. But the elasticity index, I really advise people to look at this parameter, because particularly in this kind of thing, that can be part of the explanation.
Great, that's a great add. Thank you. Are there any tools for barley flour assessment, flour or mixed with wheat flour, or even dough coming from wheat and barley flour?
Definitely the Mixolab is the tool for that.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Didn't know that. We bake burger buns, and some of the recipes have blisters on the crown. Could that be due to weakness from the flour? How can we avoid this problem? Alba, this is a great question for the forum. So if you could go to the forums to ask this question, we would appreciate that, because blisters can be caused by many things, not just the flour quality, and different processing conditions, different flour, different ingredients is going to cause that. So that question itself can take up a whole hour. So I'm going to skip over this question and have you go to the forums to get it more thoroughly answered. All right, Lindsay asks, Lindsay asks preservatives. So she stated that the preservatives she used are Calpro, fumaric acid, and potassium sorbate. Mark.
Okay, so yeah, the fumaric and the potassium sorbate should be encapsulated. Then they'll have a much easier time. Yeah.
Correct.
Yep.
Malik asks, how about RVA in assessing flour quality? I do not have much experience in that. Mark, do you?
No, not really. We've used RVA mostly just for looking at dough properties, but not so much for flour quality.
Right. So RVA
like,
is Rapid Visco Analyzer.
yep. Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's really good for.
It's mostly for starch, right?
Yeah, starch, like
yep.
cakes and stuff.
Exactly,
like that.
exactly,
Yeah.
and that's a very good tool. I can tell you that's probably one of the best of this category but for looking at starch properties, because of course it's using a very diluted dough. It's a slurry, in fact, because you put 3.5 gram of if I'm not mistaken, 3.5 grams of flour into 25 milliliter of water. So you can see how diluted is it. So it's extremely good for looking at starch properties, because the starch can really take water and gelatinize and everything. So it's wonderful. But the thing is that when you are baking dough, you are not in that conditions.
Yeah, because I mean,
so yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to tell you what your starch damage is. It's only going to tell you if there's pre-gelatinized starch there or how well it gels and things like that.
And in that case, I think, and that's the 80% of the Mixolab I was referring before. The 80% of the Mixolab, which is looking at what happened when you heat up the dough and cooling down, is certainly a very good indicator. And in that case, it may be a better indicator.
Awesome, thank you. So we talked about Satu's problem with the puff pastry dough. The follow-up question is the gluten rate an indicator of proper puff pastry? Our flour has 27 to 32 wet gluten. Do you prefer a weaker flour for puff pastry?
That's again the whole story. It's, in fact, here you are replacing the protein content by the gluten content, but again, it's a matter of content, and the content is one thing, but the quality is another thing. So you could not definitely say, okay, because I have a 27-32 wet gluten, I'm sure it's good, because if the quality of this gluten is bad, you will go nowhere. Just one example, in some southern part of Europe, in Turkey also, or in Spain, we several times we have bug infested wheat. And this bug infested wheat is damaging the protein. So if you look at the protein content, you've got the content. But if you look at the quality, you go nowhere. So take care about that. Baking is not a matter of quantity, it's more a matter of quality.
Quality, yeah.
Correct. It is 10:15. We have gone over our time. So Satu, thank you for your questions. I would like to encourage you to move a lot of them over to forum, because your questions are very valid, but requires more time from peer help. So I would like to thank Arnaud and Mark for coming on today, because you just brought this awesome knowledge and you helped a lot of bakers today. So if any of you have any more questions, please go to our forums and type it on there, and Mark and I'll encourage Arnaud to be on there, to continue the discussions as well. So I appreciate everyone's time today, but we need to end this, and this recording is going to be available next week. All right. Any last words, Arnaud or Mark?
Thank you both. That was a great moment. Very enjoyable.
Yes, thank you for having me. We just always have too much fun.
We always have too much fun. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.